Imagine for a moment a world where one country, just one, sits right at the center of almost every major global decision. Its military bases stretch across continents, its currency anchors global finance, its culture dominates film, technology, and media. And when crises erupt, most governments instinctively look to that country for leadership. For decades after the Cold War, that country, of course, was the United States. But here's the thing: global dominance isn't only about raw power. No, it's also deeply, deeply about trust. And over just the past few years, a series of dramatic events has really started to reshape how much of the world views American leadership. Now, the United States is still immensely powerful, don't get me wrong.
Its economy remains the largest on Earth. Its military budget, that exceeds $800 billion annually, and the US dollar is still the backbone of global trade and finance. But dominance also depends heavily on cooperation, and increasingly, many countries are genuinely questioning whether Washington still plays the role of a predictable partner. To really understand why, we have to look at several recent events that reveal a much deeper shift in the entire international system. And one of the most striking examples, it unfolded thousands of kilometers north of Washington, way up there in the Arctic. So back in 2025 and 2026, President Donald Trump brought back a pretty controversial idea, one that had actually popped up years before. He thought the United States should acquire Greenland. Now, Greenland, as you might know, is this massive island currently controlled by Denmark, a key NATO ally.
And why Greenland? Well, it's packed with enormous deposits of rare earth minerals, sits right on strategic Arctic shipping routes, and its location is just perfect for missile defense systems. Trump argued it was absolutely vital for American national security. He even declared the U.S. would get it one way or another. And get this, at certain points, officials even hinted that military force couldn't be ruled out. For European governments, the reaction was, shall we say, immediate. Greenland's prime minister publicly declared straight up that the island was not for sale. Political parties all across Greenland then issued a joint statement flat out rejecting American pressure, insisting that Greenlanders do not want to become Americans. Large protests erupted across Greenland and Denmark, with demonstrators carrying signs that screamed, "Hands off Greenland," and "Yankee go home." And for NATO allies, well, the whole situation was even more unsettling. Imagine this: the United States, the most powerful member of the NATO alliance, was actively pressuring the territory of another NATO member. And get this, the dispute really escalated when Washington slapped tariffs on several European countries. These weren't just random tariffs. They were linked directly to Arctic security discussions and negotiations over Greenland. Even traditionally close allies started quietly coordinating their responses. Canada and France, for instance, opened new diplomatic missions in Greenland. A clear signal, right? They were showing support for Danish sovereignty amidst all these growing tensions. In diplomatic circles, the message was crystal clear. The United States was starting to look less like the guarantor of the international order, and honestly, more like a competitor within it. And then, a similar shockwave hit Latin America. In early 2026, U.S. forces intervened directly in Venezuela. During this operation, Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro was captured. U.S. forces didn't stop there. They seized oil shipments and asserted control over parts of the country's petroleum revenues. The official justification? To stabilize the region and reduce Chinese and Russian influence in Venezuelan energy markets. But globally, this move sparked a fierce debate. Critics immediately jumped in, arguing that Washington seemed to be bringing back a very specific 20th century style of intervention. You know, the idea that the U.S. could just directly reshape governments right here in the Western Hemisphere. And for many countries in Latin America, this brought up some truly uncomfortable historical memories, thinking back to earlier American interventions during the Cold War. But wait, there's more. At the very same time, the rhetoric around U.S. territorial expansion also piled onto the controversy. President Trump, he repeatedly joked, sometimes, a little ambiguously, about the possibility of Canada becoming the 51st state, Greenland the 52nd, and Venezuela the 53rd.
Even when these statements were meant to be humorous, they absolutely carried real diplomatic consequences. Canada's leadership responded pretty bluntly. The country is not for sale. And listen, in international politics, symbolism, it matters. Maps even started circulating online, showing Greenland, Canada, and Venezuela all absorbed into a greater United States. And this really fueled concerns among allies about Washington's strategic intentions. And just to add to the global unease, meanwhile, tensions were also steadily rising in the Middle East. Recent military actions against Iranian targets, combined with constantly shifting alliance commitments, have really made some countries wonder, are American security guarantees still stable? Are they reliable? Analysts are now warning more and more that a transactional foreign policy, one that's super focused on immediate strategic advantage, can seriously undermine those crucial long-term alliances. In fact, some experts argue that this very unpredictability might be even more damaging than outright hostility. Look, allies can handle disagreements, right? But when there's deep uncertainty about intentions, well, that makes coordination incredibly difficult, almost impossible. And at the same time, Washington has pulled out of dozens of international organizations and agreements. They're stepping back from institutions that America itself helped build after World War II. These institutions, everything from climate programs to development agencies, used to be powerful tools of American influence. They allowed the U.S. to shape global norms and share responsibility with other nations. It was a win-win, but leaving them, that creates a huge space for other powers to simply step in and fill that gap. And guess who's doing just that? China. For example, they've been massively expanding their role in international institutions, development lending, and huge infrastructure investments through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. When the United States pulls back, when it reduces its global engagement, guess what happens? The balance of influence, it quietly shifts. But the real issue here isn't just one policy or one decision. Now, it's the cumulative effect. Now, think about it. Greenland tensions with Europe, military intervention in Venezuela, expansionist rhetoric toward Canada, shifting commitments in the Middle East, and withdrawals from international institutions. Now, each of these events by themselves might not completely transform how the world sees things, but together they contribute to this broader narrative that many countries are really starting to internalize. The narrative that American power is becoming less predictable and, well, less cooperative. And when countries start to doubt the stability of a superpower's leadership, what do? They start exploring alternatives. Europe, for instance, is discussing greater strategic autonomy. Asian countries are diversifying their security partnerships. Regional alliances, they're growing stronger. The world, slowly but surely, is reorganizing itself around multiple centers of power. Now, this absolutely does not mean the United States is collapsing. Far from it, actually. The U.S. still remains the most powerful military force on Earth. And its universities and technology companies, they still drive global innovation. Silicon Valley continues to shape the future of AI, computing, and biotechnology. But here's the thing. Global leadership isn't just about strength, is it? No, it's about legitimacy. It's about whether other nations see that leadership as stabilizing or entirely self-interested. For much of the 20th century, American power was deeply embedded within alliances, institutions, and shared rules. And that structure, it helped transform raw power into true global influence. But when those structures start to weaken, the very character of power changes, and the result is a world that feels less centered around Washington. Not because America has suddenly become weak, oh no, but because the international system itself is becoming more fragmented, more competitive, and definitely more multipolar. And in this kind of world, even the strongest country cannot dominate alone.